Hello everyone, this is James Shore with another how-to video. I'm recording this on September 16th, 2015. In this chapter, we're working on front-end modules, the ability to split our application into multiple files. And in the last episode, we just finished getting that set up so it's all automated. And now we have the ability with one command to run all of our tests with it requiring an additional file. And we also have the ability to set up a production application that runs in a web browser in this index.html. And the way that is built is with one command, when we say we're ready to serve it locally, it builds a generated distribution file that bundles everything together using Browserify and copies our files into the correct location. And that is all just fantastic. There's one piece remaining that we haven't covered yet, and that is third-party modules. Now, we already have lots and lots of third-party modules in our build script. You can see we're using Semver and JSHint and Karma and Shell.js. We've set those up in our build file over time. What we don't have yet is any front-end modules. Now, way back when, in episode 11, when we first introduced the idea of assertions, we did use a third-party module for assertions. We had Chai, if you recall, which provided assert.equal and other useful assertions to us. But when we moved to doing our Karma tests and actually testing our code in the browser, that stopped working because we didn't have the ability to require Chai. So what we did is we just took it out and wrote our own little assert equal just as a stopgap. But now that we have the ability to use modules again, I want to bring Chai back in as a proper front-end module. Now again, browsers don't understand modules, at least not yet. In order to make modules work in the browser, you have to use a third-party tool such as Browserify to bundle all your files together into one. So what that means is that using a third-party module on the front end isn't as simple as just doing npm install and require it. There are different ways of managing these front-end modules. And actually, one of them is npm. You can use npm to download front-end modules and install them. The problem with that is that it starts to conflict with Karma. In order to get an npm module to work with Karma, you have to add it to your list of loaded files and to your preprocessors. And not only do you have to add the file, you have to add the package.json and jump through some sort of ugly hoops. For example, if we wanted to use Chai, what we would do is we would say, well, we'd have to look at Chai and say, holy moly, there's a lot of stuff in here. And then we would come down here and say, we want to include node modules /chai /package.json and node module /chai all of its JavaScript as the files for Karma to load. And we then would do the same thing down here in our preprocessors. We'd have to put those down as being common.js files like that. And then if we did that, then we could come into our addition test and say var assert equals require chai dot assert, just like we did before. Let me show this to you. Now, this won't work by default because we haven't reloaded our configuration file. So you can see this is what you would normally get. Could not find module chai. But if I go into our Karma tab, kill it, relaunch it, that will disconnect all of our browsers, but I can reload one of them here. Come on, you. There we go. And then run it again, telling it to ignore the browsers that aren't started yet. You'll see that that does work. So that's one way to do it. We can install modules with npm and then configure Karma. Another way to do it is to install modules using Bower. Bower is a very common, very popular package manager. However, it doesn't manage dependencies very well. And personally, I'm not a fan, and I don't really have a good reason for it. It just seems like it adds complexity without adding a lot of benefit. The third approach, and this is my actual preferred approach, is to just manage the dependencies manually. And the reason for this is that on the front end, you're not as likely to use as many third-party modules as you will with Node and NPM. And this gives you a much better understanding of exactly what you're depending on in the browser. And that's important for the browser because the amount of space your modules take up and how much stuff you're loading in is still very important on the browser. So for the browser, what we can do is just go to the website and download the code. And that's what I actually plan to do with Chai and what I tend to do with our front-end modules. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back the way it was when we started. And the simplest way to do that is just do git reset hard -- hard. That says destroy any changes from our last since our last check-in. It doesn't delete any files that were added, but we didn't add any, so we don't have to go through and delete those. I'm going to restart Karma so that we get our old configuration file back. And I'll go ahead and reload all the browsers. And just make sure everything's still working. There we go. So what I'm going to do is show you how you can manage your modules manually, which again is my preference for front-end code. And that's because I just don't feel like the ecosystem is mature enough yet for tools like Bower and NPM. It's getting there, and in a couple of years it probably will be. But right now, I still prefer to do it manually. The way we're going to do that is we're just going to go to the download button. It's going to bring up just the file. I'll do a save with Command S, or you can do Control S on Windows. I'm going to save this to my downloads directory. And then I need to find a place to put that file. What I like to do is have a vendor directory that's part of my source directory, but not mixed in with my regular code. That way it's clear at a glance what files I'm depending on. So I'll grab that Chai file and put it in the vendor directory. And then one other trick is to rename the file to include the version number so that when you're looking at it in the future, you can tell at a glance which version you have. So for Chai, I believe our current version is 2.1.0. Yeah, it is. You can see it right there. So I've renamed this to be Chai version 2.1.0. Now that we have this in here, we can require it by saying var assert equals require // vendor / chai -2.1.0.js and then .assert as we do with Chai. And again, if you want a refresher on why we're doing that, check out How To episode number 11. Now, that on its own will not work because again, we need to tell Karma about this file in order for it to come up in our tests. And actually that did just work, and I'm kind of surprised it did. Oh, but you know why? Is because Karma is already set up to load all of our source files as CommonJS modules. However, not every third-party file you download will actually be loadable as a CommonJS module. It turns out that Chai is, and many of them will be, especially the newer ones. But some of the older ones, including older versions of jQuery and maybe current versions of jQuery, can't be loaded with CommonJS. And for those, you'll need to access them with a global variable. And for that reason, I actually don't just blindly load all of my vendor files using CommonJS. I instead will just load out the ones I care about. So in this case, I want to change this from loading all of our source code to just loading our JavaScript code, and then we'll load the Chai file separately. So I'm going to say source vendor Chai 2.1.0.js. And this may be me being a little too paranoid. What we had before does work, and it will work for most of the cases. But when you try to bring down a file that doesn't work with CommonJS, it won't work because it will try to create a global variable, and the CommonJS module format will prevent it from doing that in many cases. So let's go ahead and add it as a preprocessor here. Again, just being a little defensive in my programming here, it may work fine for you to just load everything all at once. And I'll need to make sure this is just the JavaScript directory as well. If we had CommonJS try to do a file twice by having it do all source files here and then just the Chai file, we'd get really wonky behavior out, and we don't want that. So with that, we should be able to restart Karma. So go over to the Karma tab, restart it, and reload all the browsers. That should still work, and it does. And now we can go into our addition test, and rather than using assert equal, we can instead use assert.equal. And hopefully that will work. And it does. Great. Let's go ahead and check this in. Let's see, we've installed Chai for assertions. And we can now get rid of the Chai node module that we have because we're no longer using that. So let's go ahead and say npm uninstall Chai, and we'll save that to our package.json, or technically take it out of our package.json. And our npm version of Chai is no longer needed, and this should all still work. And it does. Great. So this is good. However, there's one more thing I want to talk to you about with regards to third-party modules, and that is the importance of isolation. You know how I've been talking about not repeating yourself, and when we see a common variable, factoring it out into a constant? Well, that idea of not repeating yourself is more subtle than just repeated variables, and it's more sophisticated as well. As we add additional tests, each one of them is going to need this var assert equals require vendor chai.2.0.js. When we upgrade our version of Chai, we're going to have to go through every single one of those files and upgrade this line of code. That's going to be a pain in the butt. Now, we could work around that by not calling it chai-2.1.0, but in the future, we may want to switch to a different assertion library, or we might want to write our own. This is very common. So as you're developing, you always need to think about, what do I do when, not if, but when my desires change, when my needs change, when my design changes? How hard is it going to be to make that change? And right now, with every single test needing this line of code, that is going to be expensive. So what we want to do is isolate our dependency on third-party libraries. And this is a general rule of thumb. Whenever you have a third-party module, or a third-party library as it's also called, you want to make sure that it's isolated, that you only use it in one place, so that when, not if, you change it or upgrade it or want to customize it in some way, there's just one place to do that. So the way we're going to do that is by introducing our own assert.js module. I'm going to create a new JavaScript file called assert.js, and I'm just going to have this module load up Chai. So we're going to take this line of code right here, and then we're going to export it. We're going to say that the result of this module is just Chai. So the way we do that, if we want to export, if we want to set all of the exports at once, we say module.exports equals assert. And if we do that, now rather than saying require Chai here, we can just say require assert. Now let's make sure that still works. And it does. And with that, we've now isolated our Chai library so that in the future, when we want to change it, we don't have to change every test. We just change this one assert.js. It's a little trick, but it's super important, and you probably won't have heard it in your education up until now because it's kind of a subtle point. The idea that requiring a library is a form of duplication. It's really easy to fix. Just isolate it behind another library, and now we have the ability to change this anytime we want. Really simple, really straightforward, but incredibly powerful. I'm going to go ahead and check this in. What we've done here is we've isolated Chai behind an assert.js wrapper. This code is called a wrapper, or in a way it's a wrapper. When you have one file that is responsible for forwarding calls to another library, that's a wrapper. Now, technically here we're not doing the forwarding, so some people might argue that this isn't technically a wrapper, but I'm going to call it a wrapper anyway. That's a little bit of nuance that only people who really care about these things are going to argue about. Otherwise, you don't have to worry about it. So yeah, we've isolated Chai by wrapping it in another function. Extremely useful and something I highly recommend whenever you use a third-party library. In some cases, you want to just export the whole thing. In other cases, you're going to want to write a proper wrapper where you create an interface, or you create functions that makes more sense for what you do than just copying the functions out directly. And with that, our chapter on third-party modules is done. And in fact, all of our preparation for doing development of our tabs application is now complete. So in the next chapter, we're going to start working on the actual tab application and start doing test-driven development of front-end code. I'm looking forward to it. In the meantime, your exercise for this episode is to get Chai installed as a vendor dependency, as a manually managed dependency. Get it set up working with karma.conf.js. It will work by default with your existing karma.conf.js, but I think for safety, it's better to do it this way. And once you have it set up, modify your addition test to use it, and go ahead and set it up behind a wrapper like we have here. For those of you doing the challenge exercises, take a look at the other two options. See if you can get Chai working as an NPM module and as a Bower module, and compare and contrast the two approaches. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the differences between the approaches and what you prefer in the comments under this video. Okay, that is it for our setup. Next time we get into test-driven development of our tab app. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.